Hello, everyone. I am here late at night as usual. Can't seem to keep a decent schedule, but I am putting up the podcast. I think I'm going to have to start doing these podcasts and these things in the daytime every day, no matter what. I spend so much time doing postings and creating content, but that's kind of backwards. I need to do the content at night because that's mostly writing, and do all my videos in the day. Man, but it's just so much to do during the day. All right, I'm reading from Regulating the Poor, and we're doing the chapter on cities. And let's continue. Under these conditions, disorder may occur just because of its intrinsic value. It may yield profit as in much crime, or provide escape from the boredom and frustration of daily life, as in much drug addiction or drain of rage, as in much violence. A society can retain its legitimacy, in other words, and still lose control over large masses of people simply because the structures that ordinarily regulate behavior have weakened or collapsed. Sometimes, however, the events that create disorder are accompanied by repudiation of the rules. Disorder is then likely to spread or worsen, for the disorderly act comes to be defined as morally proper, as the appropriate response of a victimized group toward the victimizers. The difference is an important one. Men may stop working because, for one reason or another, they are unable to work, or they may repudiate the obligation to work, as the young black does who remains idle on the ground that blacks are denied any but the most menial jobs. Thievery is one way of surviving, but it may sometimes come to be justified on the ground that whites have always stolen from the exploited blacks, so reparations are due. To the extent that such a transvaluation took place in the 1960s, worsening disorder. The question is why? We're doing it now. They're stealing from stores, but it's mostly because babies need milk, Pampers, things like that, and the people just don't have the money. Back to the reading. The main cause, we suspect, was the denunciatory climate created by the Civil Rights Movement. Between 1955 and 1965, various groups coalesced to repudiate American racism in the most unambiguous terms. As civil rights activists arose to attack caste arrangements in the South, similar groups mobilized in the North to attack discrimination in employment, in housing, and in education. The main legislative result was the enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, neither of which had much direct impact on poor blacks in the northern cities. But the dramatic and prolonged struggle that led to the legislation probably did have the consequence of politicizing and alienating people, especially the young in black ghettos. The emergence of civil rights as a major national issue very likely owes much of the changing posture of various white elites. During the 1940s and 50s, men in the highest places in business, philanthropy, and government began to speak out against racial discrimination. The new posture can probably be traced to changes in the economic role of blacks, changes that undermine the traditional economic uses of racism and always meant that discriminatory attitudes and practices were beginning to create economic and related problems of their own. The stakes of large-scale corporate enterprise in domestic racism have been declining since the Depression. Before that, racism ensured a surplus of cheap black labor which was used against white workers, chiefly to undermine wage levels. It was also used against whites more directly, for blacks were hired as scabs and goons to impede unionization. The history of labor violence in this country has also been a history of racial violence. Since World War II, however, the accelerated development of machine technology and the growing ability of corporations to manage markets have made low wages a relatively less important factor in profits, at least for large-scale enterprises. Accordingly, racism is also less important, for many corporate enterprises have less incentive to depress wages. As for inhabiting unionization, why do I have problems with that word? Unionization. It has become clear that by helping to discipline the labor force, large-scale unions dominated by bread and butter concerns perform a useful function for mammoth industrial organizations. But even as corporate stakes and domestic racism declined, corporate states and blacks as workers also declined. In recent decades, industry has come to require an increasingly skilled labor force. This change occurred just as unskilled blacks reached the cities in large numbers from the fields of the South, with the result that northern industrial elites were becoming as indifferent to black labor as southern agricultural elites already were. But corporate elites could not long remain indifferent to unemployed or underemployed blacks as a source of disturbances in the cities. The disturbances had partly to do with outright disorder in the ghettos, such as rising crime rates. Far more disruptive, however, at least at first, were the reaction of urban whites who panicked at the black invasion. To be sure, the streets became less safe and public schools seemed to deteriorate. But these changes were greatly exaggerated by the fear that the mere presence of a growing number of blacks on the streets and in the schools evoked. Whether the dangers were real or imagined, however, more and more middle-class whites joined the exodus to the suburbs as the ghettos enlarged, forcing economic enterprises to follow or risk being stranded in a central city without affluent customers. Taken together, black disorder and white panic were costly, and they threatened to become more costly, not least because they endangered the great property investments in the urban core. Now, at least in New York City and other cities I've been to, whites are moving back into cities and pushing blacks out, but they're not pushing them out to no suburbs, just pushing them out into the street. So the number of homeless blacks is amazing. I mean, you'll see it any city you go to, any city you go to. I've been to a number of cities, and one thing you can always count on, you'll see a bunch of homeless black men and a growing number of women now. Religious and philanthropic elites were also disturbed by the changing population of the cities. Many churches and social welfare agencies followed the white middle class to the suburbs. They're supposed to be helping. What kind of Christians are these? But many remained in the cities. And for them, the black poor posed a new reality. In some inner city neighborhoods, blacks became the only constituency available to these institutions. Protestant leaders especially were impelled toward racial liberalism because blacks were predominantly Protestant, and the strength of blacks within church councils had been growing steadily. Finally, it was inevitable that some northern political leaders would also be affected by these events, especially those who were susceptible to a mass of new black voters, or who depended on corporate, religious, or philanthropic elites, whose opposition to racism was hardening. Accordingly, some northern political leaders began tentatively to advocate racial reforms, which mainly threatened the interests of southern whites rather than of northern whites. This whole idea of corporate being against racism, I don't know when that is. I'm 52 years old. I've seen it all my life, so I don't know where it went. If it disappeared for a short period of time when I was a child, but ever since I've been old enough to know, it's been here. The effects of this growing climate of racial liberalism can be seen in events dating back to the 1930s. The congressional struggle, albeit an unsuccessful one, for an anti-lynching law in 1934 and 1935. Efforts for federal administrators to see that Southern blacks got at least something from the New Deal program. A 1941 executive order prohibited discrimination in employment. The appointment of a presidential commission on civil rights in 1947, followed by strenuous efforts by some congressmen and senators to enact a civil rights law. The Supreme Court decision in 1954 declaring de jure school segregation unconstitutional. The passage of the first Civil Rights Act of the 20th century in 1957, together with the ordering of federal troops into Little Rock in the same year. There were also attempts to deal more directly with trouble in the cities by measures intended to facilitate the assimilation of blacks. Some of the larger foundations, especially those with national interests of perspectives, were the first to act on this view of the problem. In the late 1950s, for example, the Ford Foundation inaugurated a Great Cities program through which money was funneled to urban school systems for experimental programs designed to reverse the high rates of academic failure among black youth. Later, Ford funded gray areas, projects in several cities to encourage local leaders to get together on plans for new approaches to urban problems. Foundation money, in other words, was used in an attempt to activate local professional and political elites and to induce them to be more responsive to the urban black population. A few of these events led to a direct and immediate improvement, if any at all, in the lives of poor blacks. But they did reveal the sentiments supporting traditional racial controls were weakening, at least among some elites. This was to have consequences far beyond the symbolic actions of the elites themselves. See, the problem is they don't see us as human beings. They don't see us as full human beings. A lot of people still see us as 3/5. A lot of people see us as 4/5 human beings, but they don't treat us like full human beings. And that's an issue. And we don't treat each other like full human beings either, so that's a problem. But back to the reading. As the legitimacy of many racist attitudes and practices came to be questioned by prominent northern groups, organized protests began to spread in the black community, mainly among the new black middle class. It was they who launched the direct actions phase of the civil rights struggle, attracting thousands of followers, black and white. This group was itself being shaken by economic changes, although in a very different way than the black lower class. Even while high rates of official unemployment and sub-employment afflicted those at the bottom of the black community, better educated blacks had come to be in greater demand than ever before as a result of the growing need for skilled manpower during and after World War II. Thus, in 1966, 28% of all Negro families received incomes of $7,000 or more, compared to 55% of white families. This is 1.6 times the proportion of Negroes receiving comparable incomes in 1960, and 4 times greater than the proportion receiving such incomes in 1947. However, about 2/3 of the lowest income group, or 20% of all Negroes, are making no significant economic gains. Half of these hardcore disadvantaged, more than 2 million persons, live in central city neighborhoods. In other words, 2 opposing income trends were at work in the black community: rising affluence in an expanding middle class and persistent poverty in a shrinking lower class. But if only 28% are making money, that means 72% are not. So I mean, I don't even understand how that could be seen as progress. But I guess, like they said, it was less than 28% at one point. These opposing income trends suggest why protests develop first among blacks at higher income levels. As is often the case, ascending economic fortunes stimulated ambitions. in this rising group which outpaced their actual rate of advance. They were, after all, as well educated as the traditional black middle class, but they were younger. They tended to have slightly less prestigious occupations, and they had lower incomes. Various studies of the Southern protest leader who emerged in the 1950s showed that he is the young, somewhat underpaid Negro professional. He is of the Negro middle class, but his occupational position does not yet provide him with either economic security or a comfortable income. Protest leaders, like leaders in general, are a group of a much higher class position than the sub-community as a whole. But among their fellow race leaders, their class position is relatively low. The typical protest leader is not the well-established MD, but the struggling young optometrist. The civil rights activism of the past decade can thus be understood in part as a struggle by a rising group to consolidate its position in the middle class. Direct action, in turn, accelerates the process of racial liberalization, and the new black protest leaders found ready support in the northern white community, especially among the sons and daughters of the affluent, who went south in large numbers to join the freedom rides, the Mississippi summers, the protests, and the marches, there to be beaten, jailed, and sometimes killed, with many groups in the North aroused and sympathetic. Various elites were even more inclined to repudiate publicly the nation's racist practices, and the movement won victories, first in the courts and then in the Congress. Each victory, even each symbolic victory, demonstrated that America's caste system was not only illegitimate, but vulnerable. The resulting climate could not help but affect the mass of poor blacks. For even as they were freed from institutional controls, they were led to think of themselves as exploited and oppressed by white institutional arrangements. Under the impact of these combined influences, it is hardly surprising that unrest mounted among poor blacks. This unrest, in turn, is that supposed to be redounded on some of the new activists, producing a rising tide of militancy among black leaders. Integrationist goals gave way to the raised black fist and the call for black power, to an ideology that celebrated race pride and race anger and proclaimed the need for violent struggle against oppressive white institutions. All is heightened restlessness in the ghettos. With such controls weakened and delegitimizing forces at work, disorder in the cities continued to increase. School vandalism provides one example. Pitching rocks through school windows is not a unfamiliar form of juvenile delinquency, but in recent years it has become so widespread as to represent something more than the aimless sport of uncontrolled youth. In New York City, for example, 161,000 panes of glass were broken during 1959. 10 years later, the figure had risen to 275,000 panes, an increase of 71%. They really measure everything. It's really amazing. Other types of school vandalism show similarly sharp increases. Fewer than 800 unlawful entries to schools were reported in 1959. 3,000 were reported in 1969. The number of fires set in schools also rose, from 109 in 1959 to 330 in 1969. Data on the color of those who committed these acts of vandalism are not available, but the acts themselves occurred disproportionately in ghetto schools. The sharp increase in vandalism suggests not only that social controls over youth were weakening, but that the youth were turning against the schools, deliberately making them a target of their anger and frustration. In the 80s, we didn't do that. We kind of had a little more respect for school. We just would cut school, not go. but I don't remember people really vandalizing it like that. I don't know. Maybe we should have. When they started putting all these metal detectors and all of that in there, but we didn't. This has been Regulating the Poor. I'm gonna see you tomorrow. We're gonna read, and I'm really gonna get on my grind and read some more. Next week we're gonna have a different book. I'm not sure what I'm going to read. Maybe I'll read from the book on Buddhism. I don't know. Maybe I'll read that because maybe we need some peace in this society. But I'll do that. We'll see. Until next time, take care of yourselves and be safe.